Iran Daily Briefing. Wednesday, April 1st, 2026. Iran launched cruise missiles at Qatar today, including what Qatar's defense ministry describes as a strike on an energy tanker in Qatari economic waters. That is a direct hit on Gulf energy infrastructure, and it lands on the same day President Trump is scheduled to address the nation tonight on the Iran war. We'll have full coverage of both developments and what they mean for talks that Washington says are making progress, even as the missiles keep flying. As we've covered this week, the war that began on February 28th with US and Israeli strikes on Iran has expanded steadily beyond Iran's borders. Iranian forces have struck targets across the Gulf region. Fires were reported in Kuwait and Bahrain in a single-source report from Al Jazeera, though those reports carry no confirmed timestamp and should be treated as undated. US strikes have hit Tehran and Isfahan. Today, that regional spread reached Qatar directly. Against that backdrop, two competing tracks are running simultaneously. Washington says diplomacy is moving. Tehran says there are no real negotiations. And tonight, President Trump speaks to the nation. Here is what we're covering today. Iran's missile strikes on Qatar, including the tanker report, the state of US-Iran talks, and the wide gap between how each side describes them. European pushback on the military campaign, Argentina's designation of Iran's Revolutionary Guard as a terrorist organization, and the journalist kidnapping in Baghdad, where an arrest has been made. Let's get into it. Qatar's defense ministry reported this morning that Iran launched 3 cruise missiles at Qatar on Wednesday, April 1st. Qatar's ministry says one of those missiles struck an oil tanker leased to Qatar Energy in Qatar's economic waters. Middle East Eye is the single source on both claims, and the account comes from Qatar's defense ministry directly, so treat it as Qatar's official position, not yet independently verified. The significance, if confirmed, is concrete. Qatar is a US security partner and a major energy exporter. Striking an energy tanker in a partner state's economic waters is a different category of action from strikes on Iranian territory or Iranian proxies. It puts Gulf energy assets directly in the crosshairs of this conflict. Now, the timing. This strike report comes on the same day that President Trump is scheduled to address the nation at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt, according to NPR, said Trump would provide, and this is her phrase, an important update. What that update contains, we do not yet know, but the Qatar tanker report will almost certainly factor into whatever posture Washington takes tonight. That brings us to the diplomacy track, because today the two tracks, military escalation and peace talks, are running in direct tension with each other. On Monday, March 31st, Pentagon Chief Pete Hegseth said that talks on ending the Iran war are making progress. That statement came from a press conference that, according to France 24, the single source on this, also included Dan Kane, identified in that report as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. France 24 is the sole source for Kane's title, and we're flagging that. A wrong title for a sitting US military official is a hard factual error, and we cannot independently verify it from today's intel items. What we can confirm from that press conference is that Hegseth described the diplomatic track as moving forward. Iran's foreign minister, Araghchi, tells a different story. In an exclusive interview with Al Jazeera, a single-source report, Araghchi confirmed that direct talks with US envoy Steve Witkoff have taken place, but he denied that those talks constitute negotiations. He said, separately, that message exchanges with Washington continue, but that there is no trust. In a further statement, also reported by Al Jazeera, Araghchi said he has no faith in the talks at all. So the US side says progress. Iran's foreign minister says there are no real negotiations and no trust. Both cannot be fully accurate simultaneously, and today's intel does not resolve that contradiction. What it establishes clearly is that both sides are talking, and both sides are still fighting. On the broader diplomatic picture, France and Italy joined Spain this week in pushing back on the US-Israeli military campaign against Iran, according to France 24, a single-source report dated Tuesday. Earlier in the month, France 24 does not give a specific date, so we'll label this as background context from earlier in the conflict. President Trump called longtime NATO allies cowards for their lack of support against Iran. The European pushback suggests that friction has not resolved. On the other side of the ledger, France 24 reports from a single source that Gulf states led by Saudi Arabia and the UAE are pushing Trump to continue military operations, arguing Tehran has not been sufficiently weakened by the bombing campaign so far. And Dr. H.A. Hellier, senior fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, is quoted by France 24 as stating that none of the Gulf states want the Iranian state to collapse. Those two positions, push harder but don't break the state, reflect the tension inside Gulf calculations right now, as attributed to Dr. Hellier's analysis. What to watch here? Tonight's presidential address is the most concrete near-term marker. If Trump announces a pause, an intensification, or a specific diplomatic framework, it will clarify which track, military or diplomatic, is currently driving Washington's posture. Story 1. The journalist kidnapping in Baghdad. A freelance journalist named Shelley Kittleson was kidnapped in Baghdad earlier this week. US officials said on Tuesday that the suspected kidnappers are an Iran-backed Iraqi armed group. The US State Department has separately stated that a suspect in the abduction has ties to the Iran-backed militia Kataib Hezbollah. Both of those claims come from single sources, BBC and France 24 respectively, and we're labeling them accordingly. Here is what moves the story forward today. US Assistant Secretary of State for Public Diplomacy Dylan Johnson said on social media that an individual linked to Kataib Hezbollah had been arrested by Iraqi authorities in connection with the kidnapping. That comes from Middle East Eye, a single-source report. Middle East Eye also reports that CCTV footage released by Iraqi news outlets appeared to show Kittleson being captured on Sadoun Street in central Baghdad, again a single-source claim. Kittleson is described by France 24 as a freelance journalist based in Rome. Middle East Eye describes her as Italian-American. The abduction adds another dimension to the Iran-Iraq militia relationship at a moment when that relationship is already under intense scrutiny because of the wider war. What to watch? Whether Iraqi authorities name or charge the arrested individual, and whether Washington uses the arrest to raise pressure on Baghdad over militia activity. Story 2. European pushback and Japan enters the conversation. We covered the European dimension briefly in the top story: France, Italy, and Spain pushing back on the military campaign. That development from Tuesday now has a companion piece from Wednesday. French President Emmanuel Macron met with Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi in Tokyo today. Middle East Eye, the single source on this, reports that Macron reaffirmed the importance of freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz during those talks. The meeting signals that concern about the conflict's impact on maritime energy flows is now part of major bilateral diplomacy in Asia, not just European capitals. The Macron-Takaichi meeting comes as European governments are already on record opposing the military approach. The combination of European diplomatic resistance and Asian economic concern points toward a growing international coalition that, while not yet coordinated, is applying pressure on the framework Washington and Israel have constructed for this campaign. What to watch? Whether the Macron-Takaichi statement on Hormuz navigation produces a formal joint communiqué, and whether other Asian economies with energy exposure to the Gulf, also under strain from this conflict, align with that position. Story 3. Argentina designates the IRGC. Away from the battlefield, Argentina made a significant legal move on Tuesday, March 31st, The Argentine Presidential Office announced that it has designated Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, as a terrorist organization. Argentina cited the IRGC's backing for Hezbollah, which Argentina holds responsible for a 1994 bombing of the Almia Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires that killed 85 people and injured hundreds. Both details come from Al Monitor, a single-source report. The designation is notable for its timing. Argentina is not a party to the conflict, and its move reflects how the war is reshaping the political calculus for governments with long-standing grievances against Iranian-linked groups. Whether other Latin American or non-aligned states follow Argentina's lead is an open question. What to watch? Formal responses from Tehran, and whether Argentina's move triggers additional the IRGC designations from other states in the Americas or beyond. Story 4. Nuclear dimension. One additional development worth flagging. France 24 reports from a single source that President Trump is considering a military mission to seize Iranian uranium enriched to 60%. We are labeling this a single-source claim. No second source corroborates it in today's intel items. Uranium enriched to 60% sits below weapons grade, but it represents a significant stockpile with potential weapons applications. If the report is accurate, it suggests Washington is simultaneously pursuing diplomatic talks and planning for a potential operation targeting one of Iran's most sensitive assets. That combination would represent a significant escalation of stated U.S. objectives. What to watch? Any corroboration of this report from a second source, and any reaction from Tehran or the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which monitors Iran's nuclear program. We opened this episode with Iran's missile strikes on Qatar. Here is the fuller picture. Qatar's defense ministry states that 3 cruise missiles were launched from Iran on Wednesday, April 1st. Qatar's ministry says one of those missiles struck an oil tanker leased to Qatar Energy in the country's economic waters. Middle East Eye is the single source reporting these claims, and they originate with Qatar's official defense ministry statement. No independent confirmation of the tanker strike exists in today's intel items beyond that single source account. Iran has not issued a statement on the Qatar strikes in the material available to us today. Those are the sourced facts. The rest, damage extent, casualties, Iranian intent, is not yet reported. 3 specific things to watch in the next 24 to 48 hours. First, President Trump's address tonight. Scheduled for 9 p.m. Eastern Time, per NPR. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt described it as an important update on the Iran war. Given today's Qatar tanker report and the stated progress on talks, the address could clarify whether Washington is moving toward a pause, an intensification, or a specific diplomatic framework. This is the highest priority item to track. Second, Qatar's response. Qatar's defense ministry has publicly named Iran as the source of today's cruise missile strikes. How Qatar responds, diplomatically, militarily, or through international channels, will shape whether this becomes a bilateral Qatar-Iran crisis layered on top of the existing war. Watch for any Qatari statement at the UN or through Gulf Cooperation Council channels. Third, diplomatic track verification. Hegseth said on March 31st that talks are making progress. Iran's foreign minister says there are no real negotiations. Tonight's presidential address may either confirm or contradict Hegseth's characterization. If Trump announces a diplomatic framework, that would corroborate the US side account. If he announces an escalation, it would not. Pay close attention to whether the address mentions Iran's uranium stockpile, which would signal that the reported seizure mission is being moved closer to execution. Today's briefing covered Iran's reported cruise missile strikes on Qatar, including what Qatar's defense ministry describes as a strike on an energy tanker, Alongside the widening gap between US and Iranian accounts of diplomatic progress, European and international pushback on the military campaign, the arrest of a suspect in the Baghdad journalist kidnapping, Argentina's the IRGC designation, and a single-source report that Washington may be planning a mission targeting Iran's enriched uranium stockpile. We'll be back tomorrow morning with coverage of tonight's presidential address and whatever it sets in motion. If you found today's briefing valuable, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. New episodes every morning.